Howdy y'all, welcome back to the channel. I want to try and have a little patience here. I've been trying to make this video for the last few hours and the audio or the app keeps crashing. My phone and computer have both restarted without my knowledge while working on this video, and I've lost the audio multiple times. So I'm going to try and be patient and present this information to you, even though seemingly somebody out there doesn't want me to. Now, what we're going to talk about today is Madison Square Garden, and we're going to talk about the different renditions of Madison Square Garden, including the buildings that were knocked down to create the current rendition of Madison Square Garden. Now, what got me looking into this information is I was watching a video about the Colosseum of Rome, and people in the comments of that video were talking about modern day Colosseums, modern day gardens and different centers, stadiums of that nature, and they were saying that they were so impressed with the nature of the current stadiums and how glorious they are. And I'm not sure if this person was trolling or not, but a lot of people seem to echo what he was saying, and they all discussed Madison Square Garden, and I really just wanted to correct them, or at least provide them with more information, because the current rendition of Madison Square Garden is nothing compared to earlier renditions of the garden, as well as the earlier building which the garden now sits on top of. So we're going to discuss that today, and I'm going to dive right into it. Now, I couldn't make this up, but as I continue to try and record this video, now the fire alarms in my building are going off. Literally, I'm trying everything to make this video, but I'm not sure what is going on. Everything seemingly is trying to stop this. Okay, so I'm just going to take that as a godsend that this information is important and it needs to be shared, because there wouldn't be a reason that my mechanical devices would be telling me not to share it unless it was important. So let's dive into it finally. The first garden. And as we begin, you'll find the history right out of the gate is convoluted. The first garden is said to have been built on top of the remains of a tiny railroad depot. And there's no date of construction of this railroad depot. And the railroad company is a tiny one that was defunct in the early 1900s. So you have this tiny railroad depot, and it is leased to P.T. Barnum in 1874. Now, that same year, P.T. Barnum turns this little railroad depot, the remains of it, into the Great Roman Hippodrome, which measured 420 feet by 200 feet. And I'll try and include some pictures of it, but this place was epic looking. Now, it's listed on the Wikipedia, this is all according to the narrative, that this place didn't have a roof, yet it's clearly shown with a roof. It's also listed that the first boxing matches in New York took place in this building, the Hippodrome, and they were illegal at the time. It's also said that the first Westminster dog show took place in the Hippodrome. And lo and behold, the whole building that was leased to Barnum, this whole railroad depot, was owned by the Vanderbilts. So Madison Square Garden owned by the Vanderbilts, at least the first rendition of it. And now, this is where it gets even stranger. You have this Great Roman Hippodrome that was put together by P.T. Barnum, and yet it stood for less than 20 years, as it was sold to J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, and W.W. Astor in 1890. Alright, so I'm going to try and discuss the second building again. That audio for some reason was lost again. So the second Madison Square Garden was built by all of these new millionaires of New York City, the J.P. Morgan, the W.W. Astor, and our friend Andrew Carnegie, railroad baron. And this second building, they say, was built in the Moorish architecture style. Now, when we look at it, obviously we see all the old world architecture tropes. We see the pillars and we see the domes, and what we see especially is the tower and the Antiquitech, including the statue of Diana, which sat on top of this building for only a few years. And why was it there for only a few years? Well, apparently the architects and the owners of the building deemed that this statue was simply too large to be on top of this building and on top of this tower. So they removed the statue of Diana, and then they shipped it to the World's Fair in Chicago. So what happened to it at the World's Fair, you ask? Well, just like all other things throughout history, this statue was burned. And all recreations you see today are all smaller and do not hold the original glory of this Moorish architecture statue that they say was built in 1890. Very beautiful, very mysterious. And this rendition of Madison Square Garden, in my mind, being one of the most glorious buildings to ever sit in New York City. What's crazier about it is you always wonder about the architects of these buildings and how the narrative has written them, whether inherited or learned. How did they construct these? And you always want to ask and hear their own version of the story. But what's interesting about the second rendition of Madison Square Garden is Stanford White, the said architect, was murdered in the rooftop gardens of Madison Square Garden. And he was murdered by who? A railroad baron by the name of Henry Kendall Thaw from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now, when you look into the histories of railroads throughout the United States, they all really stem from Pennsylvania and Steeltown, Pittsburgh, Allegheny, that whole area. In previous videos, I've discussed the importance of Andrew Carnegie and his Southern Railroad, which failed in comparison to the Pennsylvania Railroad. And I also discussed how, beginning in the early 1900s, the Pennsylvania Railroad was beginning to be subsidized by the government. So throughout all that, you have the great Roman Hippodrome being torn down so that these railroad millionaires can construct this Moorish revival building and put a statue of Diana on top. That would be the most glorious statue in New York City at this time on top of any building. And they also say that it was Diana and not the same princess or goddess as the Statue of Liberty. They're saying we had all these female personifications of victory throughout our New York City greater area. What did this mean, and why or how were these buildings and statues constructed? By 1925, they deemed that this glorious, amazing, beautiful version of Madison Square Garden was not enough. And then when you see the building that they replaced it with, that they tore down this glorious Moorish architecture building and replaced it with, you will have yourself a laugh. But first, let's look at a few more photographs of the second rendition of Madison Square Garden. Also, look here when the Alaska picture comes up. I'll zoom in on it. But you can see that the Southern Railroad Company, Carnegie's, and the other millionaires' failed railroad company is being advertised in Madison Square Garden, the second rendition. And what happens afterwards will really tie together how Carnegie and these millionaires really did beat out the Pennsylvania Railroad. So if you're still with me, please drop a like. Show me that you're still here and that this is working for you. And I'm going to try and talk about this third Madison Square Garden without any interruptions and without the audio getting deleted. There might be a few choppy experiences in here because I'm going to need to keep stopping and saving the audio. But the third Madison Square Garden that was began in 1925 was financed by the boxing guru and promoter Tex Rickard, and it would become synonymous with his name being known as the house that Tex built. And this third rendition, which you can see just by the pictures, really pales in comparison to the original two renditions of the Madison Square Garden. I mean, look at this architecture and then compare it with the old ones. The first and second renditions appear to be palace-like in construction and old world with their architecture, while the second rendition of the garden did have all the modern amenities that still made it serviceable. So why would you replace a beautiful Moorish architecture building like that with something like this, when this isn't really as eye-catching and this isn't really as pleasing, and this building doesn't really invoke as much when you view it as these old world structures? I truly don't understand it. And furthermore, you'll find that the third Madison Square Garden was smaller than the last rendition. It could house more people inside as far as seating, but it was a smaller building. It took up less area. However, it stood for a longer amount of time, being the main garden from 1925 until its demolition began in 1968. And during this time, it became home to New York's major sports teams, as well as becoming the image synonymous with Madison Square Garden in most people's heads. That's why when this third version of the garden was torn down in 1968 to build the new one became so glorious to everyone. Because compare the new, modern, current Madison Square Garden with this third rendition, and yes, you will say, wow, that's quite an advancement. But if you compare this new rendition, the current rendition of Madison Square Garden, with the first, the Roman Hippodrome, or the second rendition, you'll notice that, hey, we tore down old world structures, beautiful Moorish architecture structures that we now glorify. We tore them down in the 1900s, the early 1900s, to make way for these ugly modern buildings. And it just really does not make much sense. And it makes even less sense when you look into the building that was torn down to make the current Madison Square Garden. That building is the Penn Station, or the Pennsylvania Railroad Station. If you know anything about this type of historical architecture research, you probably know the Penn Station already. It's one that we really talk about a lot. I'll just leave some of these photographs with you, but basically this was one of the most glorious buildings and the most glorious railroad station to ever grace this earth. It was modeled after the Acropolis, St. Peter's Square, and the Brandenburg Gate. And it stood on over 8 acres of land. Now I'm just going to give you some numbers to go along with the photographs, although I do believe the photographs speak for themselves. But the Penn Station took 3 million cubic yards of dirt and mud to be removed for it to be created. 3 million cubic yards of dirt and mud were removed for this building to be created. 490,000 cubic feet of pink granite were used in the construction. 60,000 cubic feet of quote-unquote stone was used in the construction. 27,000 short tons of steel were used in the construction. 48,000 short tons of quote-unquote bricks were used in the construction. 30,000 light bulbs were used in the construction. And this was the largest building, the narrative says, ever built in the entire world in one time, or in one sitting, so to speak. They built it all without any stops, and it was put together, and it seems to be quite a short amount of time for such a glorious building. All right, so my microphone or something is not working right, but this is the Penn Station on the inside, and we continue with the narrative, which goes that for as glorious as this rail station was, and it being unlike any in the entire world, stood for only 50 or so years, a little over 50 years, as demolition on it began in the 1960s. And this is because New York City decided that it was too gaudy and too large, and they wanted to better use the space. So after World War II, they said it just did not really serve a purpose anymore, which I question that. But statues from this Penn Station survive today in different museums around the world. However, the actual building was completely demolished so that the current Madison Square Garden could be built on top, as well as a few more buildings, a sort of financial district. But can you explain tearing down this glorious old world structure and this, the old Madison Square Garden? A lot of these buildings were torn down and replaced with lesser buildings that served the same purpose. That's what I'm trying to figure out about this history, is why tear down one thing to replace it with something that will basically not look as beautiful, not invoke anything on the inside when you view it, and make you question why it was done in the first place. So Penn Station's gone, Madison Square Garden stands today. People think this is the most beautiful stadium, and little do they know what lied there before. Thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Please leave your comments below.